Good evening, everyone. My name is Minjung Kim, and I am the Barbara B. Taylor Director of the St. Louis Art Museum. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you this evening, both in person as well as virtually. Tonight's program marks the opening of an exhibition that celebrates the museum's acquisition of 833 works of art in 2020. Catching the Moment, contemporary art from the Ted L. and Mary Ann Ellison Simmons collection, presented with generous support from the Edward L. Bakewell Jr. Endowment for Special Exhibitions. The acquisitions fill several gaps in the museum's holdings of post-war American art. There's work by 43 contemporary artists, and 25 of those artists are completely new to the museum's collection. One of the strengths of this collection is contemporary art with a social-political message and the interests, communities, issues represented, including the LGBTQ+ community, Native American artists, African American artists, women artists, anti-colonialism, anti-war, the environment, and popular culture. The acquisition was a partial gift and partial purchase. Ted and Mary Ann donated 50% of the value of the entire collection, and the museum purchased the remaining stake. For Ted and Mary Ann Ellison Simmons, collecting is an equally shared partnership in which they each bring their own knowledge, research, and passion to the pursuit of the work and the artists they choose to focus on. Mary Ann is an artist and master printer who publishes fine art prints by an international roster of artists at Wildwood Press, which she founded in 1996 in St. Louis. Ted is a Hall of Fame baseball player who started his career in 1967 with the St. Louis Cardinals. The couple, who are Michigan natives, raised their two sons in St. Louis and have been residents of the city since Ted began playing for the Cardinals. The Simmonses are passionate and inveterate collectors who started out collecting 18th century American furniture in the early years of their marriage before pivoting to contemporary works on paper in the late 1990s. We are so grateful to Ted and to Mary Ann, who are with us this evening, for their very careful collecting and willingness to share their collection with visitors to the museum. Please join me in thanking them for their incredible support. Now, tonight we will hear from 4 members of the museum staff who were involved in the creation of the exhibition. Exhibition co-curators Elizabeth Wyckoff, Andrea Ferber, and Claire Cobesa, and conservator Sophie Barbizon, who contributed an essay to Catching the Moment catalog in which she detailed the technical aspects of contemporary printmaking. Elizabeth Wyckoff has been the curator of prints, drawings, and photographs at the St. Louis Art Museum since 2010. Previously, she worked at the Davis Museum and the Cultural Center at Wellesley College, the New York Public Library, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She received her PhD in art history from Columbia University with a specialization in early 17th century Dutch printmaking and publishing. Throughout her career, Elizabeth has organized and co-organized exhibitions of old master to contemporary prints, books, and drawings on topics ranging from the reception of tobacco in early modern Europe to oversized Renaissance prints from 16th and 17th century Europe to post-World War II in the United States. Many of the exhibitions that she has organized at the St. Louis Art Museum relate to transformative acquisitions, including contemporary art from the collection of Ted L. and Mary Ann Ellison Simmons. 16th Century Prints relating to Hieronymus Bosch in 2015, European and Renaissance and Baroque prints in 2017, and abstract work by Black artists in 2019. Sophie Barbazan is the Associate Paper Conservator for the St. Louis Art Museum. She previously worked at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and the Smithsonian American Art Museum as a fellow. Sophie graduated in 2016 with a master's degree in paper conservation from the Institut National du Patrimoine in Paris, France. Claire Cobesa is the Assistant Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs and Study Room Manager. She was previously a fellow at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where she curated an exhibition exploring the diverse ways artists have approached the woodcut medium across its history. She received her PhD from Columbia University in 2020. Andrea Ferber is the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Fellow for Prints, Drawings, and Photographs. She's worked at SLAM since 2019 and publishes regularly on contemporary Indigenous art. Before joining the St. Louis Art Museum, she taught art history at several different universities and worked at museums including the Phillips Collection, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming our speakers to the stage.
Thank you, Min, for your introduction. So we're speaking from the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, Missouri, and the Illini Confederacy. We honor the indigenous peoples who have inhabited this region since time immemorial, including the over 180,000 Native Americans who live in the state of Missouri today. So thank you, everyone, for joining us on this celebratory evening as 2 solid years of intense hard work on the part of countless amazing colleagues all across the St. Louis Art Museum has come together in the opening of Catching the Moment. Most of these colleagues have gone home after another week of what they do, day after day, to perfection, but I want you to know how tirelessly they and we have worked to make this exhibition a success. This is also just one more culminating point of 2 decades in the exhilarating labor of collecting on the part of Ted and Marianne. As Min has already indicated, the newly opened exhibition marks the acquisition of this extraordinary collection of contemporary art. When Gretchen Wagner and I were canvassing the St. Louis community before our 2018 exhibition, Graphic Revolution, we knew the Simmons collection was going to hold treasures. It was no big surprise when the Simmonses were major lenders to that exhibition. It included issues and artists that were simply not represented elsewhere in the community. But we certainly did not anticipate that less than 2 years later, in December 2020, the entire Simmons collection at that point in time would come to the St. Louis Art Museum. And I add my gratitude to this couple from the tribe of gatherers, to quote Marianne, of course, for sending their rich and varied collection through our doors for the enjoyment and edification of many generations to come. It is an exemplary collection, but they are also exemplary collectors and, well, extraordinary human beings on top of that. Their many friends, family, and the artists impacted by their passion and dedication all know that very well. This evening, you'll hear from the 4 of us, my 2 co-curators, Andrea Ferber and Claire Cobesa. Andrea and Claire's contributions are manifest throughout the exhibition, and I want to acknowledge the force of their intelligence, creativity, and teamwork they brought to forging this exhibition out of the riches of the Simmons collection. And the museum's paper conservator, Sophie Barbazan, who's our constant partner in every project we embark on, will also speak. She's our co-author in the exhibition catalog, as Min said, with an illuminating essay on contemporary printmaking techniques. We very much wanted to bring her into the spotlight this evening. So the 4 of us will touch on targeted aspects of the Simmons collection, turning it around and looking at it from various angles. Our goal is to give you a small sample of the ways these newest additions to the collection can facilitate what I would call art history in action, one of the important functions of any art museum. I will begin by introducing you quickly to a handful of the strengths of the collection, Then Sophie will take us into the pores of the paper and ink that prints are made of. Claire will ruminate on works with text as primary element. And Andrea will take us into a perhaps more poignant and somber note, but one that delves into arts, one of arts and life's fundamental and inevitable mysteries. I want to get us started by giving you a snapshot of the Simmons collection. Obviously, I can't show you 833 works of art in the next 8 minutes, so I'll focus on some of the artists whose work Marianne and Ted have collected in depth, which is, again, one of the hallmarks of their collection. This silver bowl, which marks the very beginning of the exhibition, also turns out to be their first ambitious acquisition, as they made the decision to focus on collecting contemporary art. If you've seen the show, you also know that Marianne authored its label. We wanted to make sure that the collectors' voices are in the exhibition. And I don't want to suggest that Marianne and Ted were co-curators. They insistently left us curators to do our jobs, but you'll occasionally see their names on the labels and their voices in the audio guide. When I hear finger bowl, I always think back to my kind yet proper grandmother, whose collection of delicate and artful finger bowls were part of any table setting in her home. Kiki Smith's finger bowl disturbs that precious memory in a delightful, if somewhat unnerving way. Kiki Smith, she uses her own body in much of her work, often literally. Her own fingers formed the mold that made this solid silver object, and with her body. Her work challenges preconceived notions and attitudes about the body, about bodily functions, gender, sexuality, illness, spirituality, and more. She also explores iconic female figures from literature and religion. For Pool of Tears 1 and 2, she appropriated 2 of Lewis Carroll's own drawings from the original handwritten manuscript of Alice's Adventures Underground, now in the British Library. The black and white print shows Alice, who has just realized that the salt water she fell into is her own tears, and the mouse, who she hopes will help her find her way out of the water. Only the very large, hand-colored print of the assembled birds and other creatures who eventually went ashore together is in the exhibition. The other waits another opportunity to be seen, perhaps in the study room. The Simmonses received advice early on that once they focused on an artist they liked, they should follow the lines to that artist's friends and peers. And Kiki Smith was followed by works by David Wojnarowicz, Peter Hujar, and Paul Thek. 3 artists, lovers, and hard-living friends active in the 1960s through the 1980s and early 1990s, whose work shares a gallery with Smith's. The Simmons collection brings the first works to the museum by this generation of LGBTQ+ artists who we lost to AIDS. Paul Thek's Potlatch, a pen drawing on gesso in which a swan-like bird emerges from the lunar surface, is one of many drawings he made on sheets of newspaper through the 1970s and 80s. This one is on the New York Times, Friday, May 31st, 1974. The Simmonses have collected Tom Huck's work since the 1990s, when Tom was a graduate student at Washington University and Marianne was working at Island Press, then known as Washington University School of Art Collaborative Print Workshop. The holdings of work by Huck is near complete in the artist's prints, but we deliberately included a broad array of Huck's work, from Snack Time Marcy on the screen, his earliest triptych, chronicling rural society antics, to work for hire, including his first poster for a Motorhead concert, his favorite band of all time. We also included preparatory works in the exhibition, since the collection is rich in drawings and sketchbooks, as well as wood and linoleum blocks, like these for his Snack Time Marcy, the first of his epic Booger Stew triptychs. On the one hand, we can learn a lot about printmaking process from comparing the blocks and the print, but also Huck is celebrated as a master woodcutter. Please take the opportunity in the exhibition to look closely at the cuts and gouges in these 3 over life-size blocks. Even at this early stage of his career, his agility with the woodcutter's tools is astounding to behold. Marianne has been known to say that Tom is one of the great storytellers. My time this evening is short, so I encourage you to listen to the audio guide for this work, in which Ted Simmons prompts Huck to tell us the story of the ill-fated Cabbage Patch Kid doll behind this work. Enrique Chagoya is one of the other artists alongside Tom Huck, Tony Fitzpatrick, and Michael Barnes, whose printed work the Simmonses have collected in near complete depth. Chagoya's prints include appropriations and reinterpretations of the 18th century Spanish painter and printmaker Francisco Goya, but his trenchant adaptation of all manner of visual culture, high, low, and otherwise, includes his technically complex digital print on amate paper that I'm showing you here. Picasso receives his due from a Sinufo sculptor who has unceremoniously extracted the Spanish painter's arm and is consuming it in what might be termed reverse appropriation. Or perhaps this is simply Picasso's just dessert in the hands of the African artists whose work he stole from. All of this, of course, in Claude Monet's famous garden. As I wind down my portion of the talk, I wanted to juxtapose these two incredible women whose work is included in powerful single examples in the Simmons collection at SLAM, Kara Walker and Helen Frankenthaler. And here's an example where the Simmons collected a work by Bruce Nauman that matches up beautifully with a piece given to the museum by the legendary local print dealer Nancy Singer in 1979. Nauman reused the lithographic stone for Dead in several different prints while working with Gemini GEL in Los Angeles. The Simmonses are not shy about saying their collection speaks both directly and indirectly to the issues that have defined their lives and the times of most of us have either lived through or read about in history books. H.C., known as Cliff Westerman, is too little known, even in the art world, but I've become a steadfast fan since being introduced to the work by Ted and Marianne on my first trip to their collection about a decade ago. The Connecticut Ballroom, the series this Dance of Death belongs to, was one of the stars of Graphic Revolution, and I'm delighted to have put it on our walls in Catching the Moment. Westerman carved and printed these multi-block color woodcuts entirely by himself, crafting a pine portfolio box as well, which you will see on view in the exhibition. Westerman was a Marine who served in the Pacific in World War II, where he observed the horrors of war from a front row seat. The hulking carcass of a ship in the background is a gentle version of his death ships. The Dance of Death reprises the medieval European tradition that satirizes human folly, all in the Los Angeles harbor of San Pedro. Bombhead. Words can't truly capture the brilliance of this work. Bruce Conner's reuse of US government film and photographic footage of the atomic test blast in the Pacific in 1946 resulted in a mesmerizing film, as well as a number of related works, including this 2003 print, which in turn updates a collage from about 15 years earlier. The composition animates the mushroom cloud. It makes me wonder if the atomic blast is humanized by this work, or are we humans rather dehumanized in the horrific glory of this catastrophic destructive force we created? And I'm showing you also prints, one of other several works by Conner in the Simmons collection. Finally, I wanted to pause here for a moment in the works that greet anyone who enters Taylor Hall these days, or to be specific, on the works that greet, or to be specific, their blow-up reproductions greet us. They're enormously compelling works by two artists speaking to each other across the years and generations, who utilized digital techniques to produce headshots with distinctive attitudes. Conner, who died in 2008, was an innovator of analog film starting in the late 1950s and produced intensely handmade assemblages. But he also fully embraced digital techniques as they evolved late in his career. For Damon Davis, a self-described post-disciplinary artist, a label that actually would also befit Conner, Davis's art crosses media from music to film to graphic design and installation. It is understood from the start that his works are either scanned and manipulated digitally or born digital. And now I turn the screen over to my esteemed colleague, Associate Paper Conservator, Sophie Barbizon.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So part of our job as conservators is to understand how an artwork is made. Knowing how something was created helps inform how this artwork should be taken care of in terms of storage, exhibition, or down the road treatment. Over the last century, printmaking techniques have greatly complexified. Following the printmaking renaissance of the 50s and 60s, new publishers began to spread across the United States and new techniques were invented. This initiated a generation of composite images that present unique challenges for curators and conservators in terms of technical identification. With the acquisition of the collection of Ted L. and Marian Ellison Simmons, the St. Louis Art Museum had an ideal opportunity to advance the technical study of contemporary prints and reach out to publishers or artists to gather thorough documentation. Conservators have two main tools for the identification of printmaking techniques. The first one is observation under a microscope. You can see on your left our digital microscope, the Hyrox RH2000, used for the acquisition of photomicrographs. Observation under magnification enables us to spot visual characteristics that are sometimes inherent to a printmaking process. Digital imaging is another tool that enables conservators the observation of an object under different kinds of light. Exposing an object to ultraviolet light or infrared and capturing that image enables us to see things that our human eye cannot. UV light, for an example, can be a useful tool for pigment identification or seeing certain condition issues. Carbon pigments, on the other hand, absorb infrareds, and so this makes this imaging technique a very good tool to help identify carbon-based materials. However, due to the complexity of contemporary printmaking processes, visual identification is rarely enough. This is when interviewing artists and publishers becomes critical. In a moment, you'll be able to hear artist Tom Huck talk about the use of Okawara paper for some of his prints.
Land too. And I have to tell you, you telling me that the thing is changing colors is one of the best freaking things I've heard in a while. Because I am going out of my way to drive you conservative people nuts. Because I want my stuff to look like it was done in the 1500s. So
it's pretty important for us to know that, something that may look like a problem, discoloration, is actually something that is intended by the artist. So that's pretty important. So we sadly do not have the time to present various printmaking processes. So we will focus only on one, lithography. Lithography is originally a late 18th century planographic technique which relies on the chemical principle that water and oil repel each other. Drawing was traditionally done on limestone using an oily material such as lithographic crayon or tuche. The stone is then treated with a mixture of acid and gum arabic. So the exposed areas are etched in a sense which enables them to retain water. When an oil-based ink is applied, it is repelled by the water and sticks to the design. So here you can see artist Michael Barnes working with traditional lithography methods during his residency in Germany for his Steindruck München series, which you'll be able to see in the show. In contemporary lithography, metal plates have mostly replaced limestone ever since aluminum became readily available and relatively inexpensive in the United States during the late 40s. Photolithography came about shortly after in the 50s. This technique uses a photosensitive coating to reproduce drawings executed on transparent films. More specifically, I would like to focus this presentation on the lithographs of Enrique Chagoya. This artist has been collaborating with Sharks Ink., a publisher based out of Lyons, Colorado, for more than 20 years. Chagoya's lithographs process was developed in collaboration with Bud Shark, master printer and owner of Sharks Ink., and is a mixture of hand-drawn and photolithographic processes. So the artist would travel to Sharks Ink. With suitcases of collected images. The ones selected were scanned and printed directly onto transparent film. Chagoya would then cut them and assemble them on a larger film with transparent pressure-sensitive tape to create what we call the key image. Details were added with an opaque medium such as black acrylic paint for better precision. Chagoya's lithographs usually show a wide range of colors. So each color corresponds to a separate aluminum plate, and sometimes one print would necessitate the use of 10 to 15 individual plates. So the artist painted his designs directly on a textured film with a toner wash. I will describe what that is in a minute. Once the artist was done creating the various transparent films, they were used to expose photolithographic plates, transferring the design to the plates. So toner wash, which is a mixture of Xerox toner powder, Liquitex medium, and water, enables subtle transitions, which gives in the end an appearance similar to a watercolor wash. Chagoya uses it to create either big splatters, as you can see here, or smaller ones printed in like a light brown or a light gray to kind of create an aged appearance to the piece. The artist also varied texture by sometimes using a Stabilo pencil on the frosted film, which corresponds to certain colors, as you can see here on this photomicrograph. Chagoya's reference to Mesoamerican art is present not only in his subject matter, but also in the paper that he used for his lithographs. So amate paper is a type of bark paper, which was used for codices in ancient Mexico. During the Spanish conquest, its production was banned, but the tradition endured. Today, amate paper is mainly produced by hand in San Pablito and other villages of the Sierra Norte de Puebla. Amate is traditionally made with the bark from the ficus tree family. So the bark is first soaked and boiled with ashes, lime, or caustic soda. Sometimes it's bleached. And once the fibers are softened, they are arranged on a wooden board in a grid fashion. And then they're beaten with a volcanic rock to form a sheet. Chagoya decided to import samples to experiment its use in printmaking. However, printing on amate paper presents challenges because the bark paper has a very uneven texture and is not necessarily very flat. So to remedy this, the amate paper was run through the press before printing 3 times dry, 3 times dampened. And so this sort of like calendaring or flattening process made it more dimensionally stable and enabled the ink to sit on top and not immediately sink into the paper. Identifying the order of printing for each color in a lithograph by observation only is very challenging. However, the order of printing is generally very carefully crafted by the publisher in order to achieve a particular effect. Over the years, Buttshark developed an order of printing to get a specific aesthetic. So the white ink, for example, was laid down first for the highlights and to make the subsequent colors stand out, since amate paper is naturally a cream color. These highlights are clearly visible under UV, as the pigments in the ink absorbs UV. This is a characteristic of the pigment titanium dioxide, often found in lithographic inks. Certain lithographs also show interesting inclusions, such as these plastic irises present here. And finally, Chagoya's lithographs oftentimes have additional pieces of chine collé. So chine collé means that a tissue-thin paper is adhered on top of the main paper support. So both the tissue and the support sheet are run together through the printing press, sometimes with a thin layer of adhesive between them to reinforce the bond produced through the pressure of the press. Here, the artist plays with the transparency of a white Thai kozo paper, adhered with a thin layer of sprayed acrylic adhesive. We hope you have enjoyed this brief dive into printmaking techniques. If you would like to find out more, we encourage you to check out the exhibition catalog. I would like to thank my wonderful curatorial colleagues for this exciting collaboration. I now invite my colleague Claire Cobesa, Assistant Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photograph, to the podium. Thank you for your attention.
So on view in this exhibition, you will see themes that we chose to highlight by grouping works in different galleries. My brief consideration this evening of another theme, that of text and image, is one that stretches across galleries and is also meant to gesture more widely to the many possible routes of investigation that the Simmons collection invites and supports. We hope what you see on the walls in the exhibition is only the beginning of your encounter with the works and the stories in the collection now that it has arrived here at SLAM. The relationship between text and image is one that raises all variety of questions about the content and the means of communication, the bridges and barriers involved, and the idea of an artwork as a site to unsettle those expectations. The first gallery includes one of the earlier examples of text in the collection. June Wayne founded Tamarind Lithography Workshop in Los Angeles, California in 1960 with the goal of reinvigorating lithography as a fine art print practice. Among the many artists she invited to print there was Bruce Conner, whose challenges to ideas of authenticity and authorship did not always mesh well with Tamarind's concern with making prints capital A art. In the lithograph, this space reserved for June Wayne, Conner acknowledges and calls into question many spaces. Wayne's importance is acknowledged with text taken from a placard that reserved a place for her to park, a privilege accorded to her role. But the space of the work could also be understood as the surface of the matrix itself, a space granted to Conner as an artist invited into the workshop, but one that in this print he has quite literally returned to Wayne. It thus reads both as a respectful marker and as a subtle assertion of his own artistic voice. In this print, just across the same gallery, set at an angle that seems to send the words running to opposite ends of a page, the word pudding appears twice. It's mirrored above. The bold streak of red ink at bottom left draws attention to that very element of the work, its color that distinguishes it. Bruce Nauman here refers to a common saying, the proof is in the pudding, or that the results will provide confirmation. The word proof has another meaning in the context of printmaking, an impression of a print pulled for the artist to check that all looks as it should. Nauman played with the assumption that every impression, or every sheet, pulled from a print matrix should look the same. With this print, he had every impression printed in a different color, thus making each one a proof. His mirroring of the words makes visible the act of reversal that happens in the printmaking process itself. A word correctly oriented on the matrix will appear in reverse, and vice versa. By including both, he collapses that process onto the sheet. In Gallery 247, at the very end of the exhibition, text appears twice removed from the machine-printed labels that identify Campbell's soup. The Campbell's typeface, a form of assurance constructed through advertising, was transformed first in Andy Warhol's soup can paintings of the early 1960s, which adopted the power of text as branding. Mike Bidlow paints not from the Campbell's can, but from Warhol's painting, replicating the specifics of his style, and in doing so, drawing attention to the fact that there is one. Bidlow titles this, parentheses, not Warhol, not parentheses, not Campbell's. In doing so, Bidlow walks a line between flattening a notion of Warhol's genius by demonstrating its imitability, while also re-enshrining him in a canon of worthy-to-be-imitated artists. The traces of Warhol's versions of Campbell's soup cans reappear in the stripe of red and the emphatic circle visible here, found in Gallery 244. In this print, Jean Quick-to-See Smith uses text to rebrand the can, Venison Stew. Made here in St. Louis, the Washington University School of Art collaborative print workshop, now Island Press, with Mary Ann Simmons' help. This deeply textured collograph made by building up materials on the surface of the matrix, also takes the image in a new direction. It becomes both unmistakable in its source and entirely her own in its form. When her work engages with images such as Warhol's that form part of an established definition of a quote-unquote American canon, she subverts those images to center indigenous narratives and practices. This print questions assumptions both about the centrality of Warhol in the hierarchies of artistic practice and of Campbell's soup as a shared or even nutritious experience of food consumption. A school-aged boy grins out from the middle of this work, capturing the artist David Wojnarowicz himself at a young age in Gallery 242. 2 columns of dense text butt up around the figure, simultaneously predicting and recounting the hostility and prejudice Wojnarowicz faced growing up gay in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. The scale of the text and its adjacency to a form of imagery coded as innocent creates an immediacy and an intimacy for the viewer who takes the time to carefully read through. Here, text demands attention and time, just as it bridges a gap between a period before all the terror and sadness in the narrative and the present moment when it has come to pass. Wojnarowicz was himself a poet and a writer, and his willingness both to expose his own vulnerabilities and struggles in the face of a society that responded to the AIDS crisis with deliberate neglect can be seen as an act of defiance and self-preservation, and ultimately hope that a future child would not experience the same. This group of prints by Robert Gobert in Gallery 243 was featured in his pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2001. Installed in multiples throughout the space, they each appear as slightly crumpled bits of paper, subtly sculptural forms in their own right. The careful reconstitution of what might appear disposable sources, clippings from the New York Times and the New Yorker, a written plea for a cat sitter, involved the work of specialized papermakers and printers to transform found objects through a practice of artistic making. Here, the text rides along with the object, retaining the choice of typeface that identifies the printed source or the appearance of a hand, so that the words mark the limits of the information being communicated, and that identify as well a history of circulation, from mass media or public posting to someone's pocket or desk, and then now into the space of an art gallery or museum. Enrique Chagoya's engagement with all variety of textual and visual sources enlivens his remarkable body of work, with the premise that everything is fair game, but always with histories in mind that some practices have not been treated as fairly as others. Language in many forms features heavily in his work, and its multiplicity throws into relief the question of legibility. Very few viewers will be conversant in all of the languages present, just as they may not recognize the source material for all the images. But sitting in the potential discomfort of a space of unknowing also invites the joy of finding ways to communicate across those divides. In his codices, several of which are on view in Gallery 244, Chagoya returns to the accordion folded forms and the amate fig bark paper that characterized much pre-conquest book production in Mexico and Central America. One result of that 15th century European conquest was the deliberate destruction of most of those books and the knowledge and culture they represented. Among the many images in Escape from Fantasylandia, shown here, are Mayan glyphs taken from the so-called Madrid Codex, one of a few survivors. The inclusion of these Mayan writing and numbering systems surfaces the precarity of language and the potential for loss of understanding. Whether evoking narrative practice, unpacking the inner workings of printmaking, or appending expectations of linguistic hierarchies, all of these works speak to artists' engagement with text as visual representation in the context of larger concerns around power and meaning. I hope either in your visit to the exhibition or through an appointment in the study room for prints, drawings, and photographs, which can now be made online at slam.org if you click on art, You will continue to explore the many worlds opened up by the acquisition of the Simmons Collection here at SLAM. And I'd like to invite Andrea L. Ferber, the Andrew W. Mellon Fellow for Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, to conclude.
My lecture is dedicated to my dad, not because of the topic, but because his support through my life allowed me to pursue my education, which eventually brought me to SLAM. Death is one of the most persistent themes in the history of art. Within this theme, one can parse distinct motivations for addressing the most certain and mysterious event in life. Powerful individuals in every era seek to establish their memory and reputation with romantic or intimidating likenesses. In this way, portraiture is more about death than life. For Christians, images of the crucifixion serve as reminders of Christ's torturous death, but also one's own forgiveness and resurrection. Vanitas still life paintings emerged in the wake of the Protestant Reformation as a way of reminding believers of their own mortality without relying on figurative scenes. Artists have long documented death, from the carnage of war to personal loss and their own death. And on a personal note, I will share that my sister died when I was 11, and when I saw this image years later, it made me empathize more with my mom's perspective of losing a child. It is no surprise then to see the theme of death as a thread running through the Simmons collection and the exhibition catching the moment. While Mike Bidlow's reproduction of Andy Warhol's Jackie is technically about appropriation and questions of authorship, we are still in the end confronted with an image of a woman mourning the traumatic loss of her young husband. Some artists, such as Enrique Chagoya and H.C. Westerman, reflect on mass atrocities. These prints by Chagoya reproduce an intaglio print by the Spanish artist Francisco Goya, one of 82 from his series Disasters of War. In the original, a French soldier smiles at the hanging corpse as if he is proud of his conquest. Chagoya replaces the soldier with a cartoon character, Dopey from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Clearly a critique of the Disneyfication of violence. Chagoya's choice of Dopey underscores the ridiculous offensiveness of capitalizing on tragedy. Other artists, including Kiki Smith, utilized the creative process to work through personal grief. She cites the powerful influence of corporeal imagery, such as Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece, on her own drawings, prints, and sculptures. When Smith was young, her family moved into her great-grandmother's Victorian home. In conversation with Helene Posner, the artist explained that an early preoccupation with mortality likely stemmed from, in part, from exploring dead things in dead parts of the house, including skeletons her artist's father kept for drawing. Maturing as an artist within a strong body-centric feminist milieu, Smith's work focused more intensively on mortality after the death of her father in 1980. She began making sculptures of body fragments. Her examination of the body intensified after her sister Beatrice died of AIDS in 1988, and she shared, "After my sister died, I began having dreams of what my artwork should be." She witnessed the same disease take her friend David Wojnarowicz from 1987 to 1992. Tailbone is one of many isolated body parts she has made from paper, plaster, glass, and bronze. One can appreciate the beauty of this complex bone, but an awareness of the influence of Catholicism on the artist also makes one see this as a kind of relic, and how the living come to venerate any tangible reminder of the dead. In 1996, Smith shifted away from a focus on the human body toward representations of animals. Prompted by an increased awareness of environmental devastation, death continued to be a theme even when she depicted different species. She has made innumerable drawings of mummified and taxidermied animals in the collections of natural history museums, which served as the basis of prints such as Destruction of Birds. As you will see in the exhibition, birds figure prominently in Smith's work, perhaps more than other animals. Smith's individuation of each animal draws attention to uniqueness often lost in any group of corpses. A desire to honor individual lives is what motivates us to seek specificity, such as photos of the dead in the aftermath of mass atrocities. And sometimes artists confront their own imminent death. Candy Darling was a movie and stage actress, perhaps best known for her roles in Andy Warhol's films Flesh from 1968 and Woman in Revolt from 1971. Writer Glenn O'Brien described her well when he said, "Candy was an artist, and she was her own artwork." Diagnosed with lymphoma in 1973, Darling asked her friend Peter Hujar to take her photo as she lay dying at Cabrini Medical Center in New York. With a full face of makeup and surrounded by flowers, friends say she relished the idea that she would be remembered as a blonde Hollywood bombshell who died young, like her icons Jean Harlow and Marilyn Monroe. Of this image, Amelia Rena wrote, "Hujar captured the confusion of expectation, reality, and fantasy that permeated Darling's entire life with an eloquence that no one else could have matched. The combination of Hujar's open-minded inquisitiveness with Darling's undeniable magnetism infuses the image with a charisma worthy of both." Darling died on March 21, 1974, at the age of 29. In May 1991, David Wojnarowicz embarked on a weeks-long cross-country road trip with his close friend, Marian Skamama. Driving from New York to San Francisco and back through the deserts in the south, the artist staged this self-portrait in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, by burying himself. At this time, Wojnarowicz had been living with AIDS for 4 years. He was easily exhausted and often suicidal. Following his wishes, Skamama did not print this photograph until after Wojnarowicz had died on July 22, 1992, at the age of 38. Of this, historian Thibault Volvain wrote, "The gap between the moment the photograph was taken and that when the print was produced indicates the meaning Wojnarowicz gave to the work, his conviction that after the end there could not be nothing left, that destruction could not take everything away." Other artists have portrayed themselves facing death, and including Frida Kahlo, Pablo Picasso, and Hannah Wilke. Frida Kahlo made many drawings and paintings reflecting her experiences with polio, a severe spinal cord injury, several miscarriages, and depression. In this painting, she quite literally reveals what is on her mind, with a skull and bones next to a grave. However, she otherwise appears healthy and without fear. This particular work was created 11 years before her death, a reflection that death was on her mind for a very long time. In contrast, Picasso shows himself as a sickly, aged, and perhaps scared older man. He died of heart failure months after making this drawing. She lived to be 47, he was 91. This audience may be familiar with Hannah Wilke's work from her recent retrospective at the Pulitzer Foundation. Criticized by some early in her career for reinforcing cultural ideas of beauty and accused of narcissism, she continued to photograph her body even as she deteriorated from lymphoma. In 1978, the artist processed her own mother's death from cancer through photography. 14 years later, she took her mother's place as subject to process her own death. These images are part of a series titled Intravenous, a play on the word intravenous, which consists of hundreds of photographs, watercolor paintings, a 16-channel video completed by her partner in 2007, as well as ephemera turned art, clumps of hair on Arches paper, bandages, and a collection of empty pill bottles and used syringes. In her essay on this series, art historian Amelia Jones suggests that, with Intravenous, Wilke extended her narcissism to externalize the psychological wounds inflicted on her Jewish female body by Western patriarchy, as well as the physical wounds produced by the cancer eating her from within. Bone marrow therapy, radiation, and chemotherapy could not prevent Wilke's death at age 52 in January 1993. Wilke's partner, Donald Goddard, shared, "These were once to be part of the cured show Hannah so offhandedly and definitively planned. It wouldn't turn out that way, the title or the wish, but I think she knew that too." Some images of death are hard to look at. In Susan Sontag's words, "We regard the pain of others and in so doing, confront our own end. We thank you so much for coming this evening to our lecture, and we're very happy to take questions.
Anyone have any questions? You explained it all so well. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.